Welcome to the webinar. And in terms of content today, allow me a very brief introduction. Then we will be talking about our topic of the day, using cloud-based data platforms to track and support the development of startup ecosystems, something really pertinent. Here at Genome, we travel to so many ecosystems around the world. And I'm always flabbergasted and astonished to see how different the availability and the use for data to really understand dynamics of an ecosystems are, how different the use cases are and so forth. So really delighted to go into the discussion today and the overview with our super high profile speakers that I'm going to introduce in a minute. Thirdly, we will talk about impact of using data properly in a startup ecosystem, and then open it up for open questions and answers. And I'd really invite you all here in the audience as well to contribute to the discussion, which we'll moderate and try to take as many questions as we possibly can. Give me one sec. For our webinar series. Our webinar is seeking to highlight tangible topics, relevant practical topics for ecosystem leaders, for practitioners, for government officials, agency leaders, in order to build up and understand different thoughts and developments in ecosystem policy and actions. To give you an example, our previous topic was focused on funding policy to startups and scale-ups during COVID and the right response, multiplying ecosystem growth and policy impact, and so forth. Future topics, the next one coming up is value creation, not valuation. How do we attract venture capital? Where we'll be delighted to have GrowthX with us in May the 11th. So if you want to mark that on your calendar, as per the usual, London time, 8 o'clock in the morning, and 8 o'clock Pacific, San Francisco time on the 11th of May, again with GrowthX. So please mark it on your calendar if you're interested in the topic. I'm delighted to be joined today, first of all, by Daniela Monteiro, the head of entrepreneurship at Porto Digital. And Daniela will give us an insight about what's happening in Porto as one of these upcoming ecosystems with really high, great dynamics and growth rates. And Yoram Wijngaarde, founder and CEO, needs no introduction, of Dealroom. And Yoram obviously will take us into the depths of database analysis for our ecosystems, I can say. Yoram, very close partner of Startup Genome. We are so glad to have this partnership. We are using so many of your data points in our analysis and cases all the time. So really glad and delighted to have you here. And with that, Yoram, you possibly are the first one to take it away. Would love for you to briefly introduce what you do at Dealroom, where you're coming from, where you're going, followed by Daniela, who will talk us through what's happening in Porto. Yoram, the floor is yours, and let me briefly get to your slide. There you are. You're still on mute, Yoram. You may need to hit the button. Thank you.
We both clicked at the same time. Yes, Stephan, thank you very much. So I'm Yoram Wijngaarde. I'm the founder of Dealroom. I'm Dutch. I started Dealroom 7 years ago, and we are a data provider. But really, our mission is to provide data transparency to entire tech ecosystems. So it's a bit different approach than being like a vendor. We try to position ourselves kind of in the center of the ecosystem and facilitating the ecosystem. So we work with governments around the world, including ScaleUp Porto, also La French Tech, Berlin, Tech Nation in the UK, Melbourne, and a couple of other places. We work with corporates like AWS, Google, Stripe, etc., who are always very interested to see what the promising companies are. And of course, we have a lot of venture capital firms as customers, so Index Ventures, Atomico, Sequoia, you name it, and they are our customers for a long time. And last but not least, we try to be helpful to startups and angels with free access, no paywalls, and giving them what they need to be successful in terms of data. So specifically to Dealroom, for governments, and kind of relevant to this discussion, we provide something we call the ecosystem platform, which is an API and a dashboard that allows you to measure and grow your ecosystem. Quick, how we collect data, because that always comes up with people who we speak with. So the way we collect data, you could break it down into 3 buckets. So one is just aggregating public data. So we use machine learning and also a lot of manual research to collect and organize the information that's out there. And I include here like things like web traffic data from SimilarWeb, but also the just which startups are out there, who did they get funding from, etc. Secondly, we take data from local APIs and local partnerships. So, and I include, for example, the work we do with Daniela in Porto, where we have local partners who know their ecosystem best. And so we work together on improving the coverage there. And then finally, what we call community sourced. So we have startups who submit data to us, angels, VCs, but also increasingly universities and regional development banks are submitting data to us to help make the platform better. And yeah, this government facing platform is expanding rapidly. So on the left, you see all the cities and countries that work with us. We're in over 30 cities and or regions, sometimes whole countries. And that's in Europe, creating like a really nice network of ecosystems that have data that they can leverage each other actually and share also insights with data that's compatible to each other.
Yeah, Yoram, thank you so much for the brief introduction. Gives us a really good picture of where you are. And we've recently seen that at Genome, the extraordinarily high quality when you deploy Dealroom, the data collection in a new geography. We did some analysis, which was really impressive to see how quickly data builds up and how quickly also community responds in adding to the data set to make it as valuable as possible. So really impressive. Daniela, over to you. Porto, an ecosystem on the rise. I've seen the growth statistics, which are truly impressive. So maybe you can give us a little overview of what's happening.
Good morning, and thank you for having us here. Speaking about our city and the work we have been doing to develop our ecosystem and to keep track on what we are doing. So I work for the city of Porto, and Porto, for the ones that don't know, is there in the north of Portugal. And I'd like to share with you a few numbers and some information about our ecosystem, so you can have like a general idea of how it has been working here. So even if the city is not that big, Porto is considered a medium-sized city with 1.8 million inhabitants in the urban area. And when we speak about ecosystem and entrepreneurial ecosystem, we always speak about the region, because this is so interconnected that we cannot avoid speaking about the region itself, the metropolitan area. In terms of companies established, they have been growing 33% per year until 2018, at least. These are the numbers we have so far. We have more than 400 startups mapped, more than 50 incubators and workspaces, more than 70 R&D centers, more than 30 active tech communities promoting these dynamics in the ecosystem. And there are some other informations that have been showing the potential of our ecosystem, like the value of our university and how important it is to the development of the ecosystem. Also, we are glad to have been positioning as the growing ecosystem internationally as a connected ecosystem internationally. So the city itself, the city of Porto, has been positioning has been using entrepreneurship and innovation as the center of the strategy for growth. Since 2015, the city has launched ScaleUp Porto as a strategy to support companies growing from Porto, so they can find here in the city the conditions to keep growing, and then they don't have to move anywhere else to keep finding these conditions for growth. And that's why in 2015, the municipality, together with a bunch of stakeholders from academia to more corporate organizations, they have worked together to launch this manifesto to put us working under this same vision of developing conditions for growth. This manifesto has 9 pillars, and 2 of them, as you can see here, are pretty much focused on learning and measuring the evolution of the ecosystem. So this is something that has been in our minds for some time now. Even though ScaleUp Porto is pretty much focused on the scale-up phase and creating these conditions for growth, we cannot forget that before we have scale-ups, we have to create the startups and we have to have the conditions for them to be created. And that's why ScaleUp Porto is a wide strategy from stand to start to scale. But and to develop this strategy, we have been implementing initiatives focused on funding, access to market, access to talent, and knowledge sharing. We have been supporting tech communities because they are the ones that will make these ecosystems sustainable in the long run. And also, we are pretty much focused on this measuring and learning topic, and that's why we are here today to speak a little bit more about this.
Daniela, thanks again.
Short.
So much for the introduction and really putting Porto on the map for us and our participants here. Certainly an ecosystem, Yoram, but also us here at Genome. We'll certainly continue to mirror and to reflect what's happening. So thanks so much for the introduction. And you pointed it out, measure and learn, to our topic, using a cloud-based data platform to track the development and to support action strategy devised in order to help our startup ecosystems. That's the topic of the day. And just to set us up a little bit, observations from our work, the work I'm seeing and traveling a lot of ecosystems every year, particularly those in less mature environments. So I'm not talking necessarily about the Silicon Valleys, New Yorks or Londons, but all the other tier 2 ecosystems and emerging ecosystems. And what we see in terms of data availability is sometimes rather patchy information, not necessarily being shared, or if it is being shared, then it is kept manually in lots of instances, investment rounds and so forth, not really making it to Dealroom and other platforms, not really making it very easily into our own reporting here at Genome, which makes it always difficult to really unlock the value of anticipating, seeing a trend. Yeah, I think sometimes lots of things are being done. They are done with ecosystem portals are being set up with lots of enthusiasm, but they are not automated. So after 3 months, everything is outdated and then people lose trust and so forth. These are observations that we are having. Whilst there's always this desire for community to enable efficient connections to really understand who is in the ecosystem in terms of support organizations, investors, the startups, the talent pools, the R&D centers, and so forth. For companies to better understand what's the community and where can I interact with the community. Startups and talent, how do I find the right opportunities? How do I, as a talent seeker, probably being located abroad, really see these opportunities that startups in a city like Porto may create for myself and make me more inclined to consider them. For investors or startups seeking investors, visibility to be seen, to be considered, to be invested after all. These are things where we really see gaps, where some ecosystems are really not outgoing enough in order to present themselves, not in marketing speak and marketing collateral, but in terms of data that actually are considered by investors, be them VCs or angel groups. In terms of ecosystem leaders, tracking against objectives as an ecosystem leader, particularly in a public-private partnership, or if you get government funding, you need to have some clear objectives, KPIs, and at least once a year or in a budget period, you need to really prove that you're doing the right things. So tracking against these objectives, but also using data to better anticipate what kind of gaps will I have in the future. I would find that very interesting and important. Tracking against these gaps, devising a strategy where we really can anticipate what's coming. So as you develop from a startup to a scale-up ecosystem, for instance, different support mechanisms that will be required, etc. These are all the considerations here. And for government in the end, I think I'd also be interested in reporting return on taxpayers' use of money. what are we actually generating? And again, I always find it difficult. National statistics don't really do the track. They are not focused as much on our ecosystems. They amalgamate too many different sorts of companies typically, and make it really difficult to prove the case and to report back to taxpayers, to the electorate, to broader society, to say this ecosystem actually is doing a lot in order to help us support the development here. Yeah, this is a little bit the introduction where we are coming from, and I would love to open it up to our debate. And let's jump in. I think, Yoram, you have a few more considerations you can give us to set us up properly.
Yeah, and it could be that I'm kind of preaching to the choir with our audience, but our kind of thesis at Dealroom is that entrepreneurship is really changing and it's enabled by technology. So I think it fits with what you just said as well. So on the talent side, like startups have over the last 10 years become perhaps the most desirable job opportunity for top talent. Like I used to work at investment banking and like when I came out of university, that was the top career choice, but it's definitely not anymore. People want to work at startups, and it is probably also the best career opportunity right now. And so you have a whole new category of entrepreneurs and operators. So it's like scientists, engineers, and generally just super smart people, not the traditional just the traditional entrepreneur that's maybe more like a sales person or like an opportunistic person. You have like big thinkers who do this. So that's a huge change that's gonna impact tech ecosystems over the next 10 years, even more than they have on the last 10 years. Then on the capital side, so most economic growth now is VC backed, and that's quite a thing. So the venture capital industry is still quite small. You know, it's not that many people work in it compared with others. It's like a tiny industry actually, but it has a massive impact. If you think about it, almost every major like unicorn and decacorn and massive like big tech companies are all venture backed, and so that's and now much more money is being put into venture capital than before. So on the bottom right, innovation is like a third big pillar for entrepreneurship. So you see the rise of academic entrepreneurs, you see big techs, so Facebook, Google spending way outspending any other industry in terms of R&D. So more than 50% of all the R&D in the US, for example, is done by tech companies now and not anymore by industrial companies. And then on the bottom left,
Yoram, excuse me, just out of interest, are we actually capturing that when we talk about spending on innovation? You know, this typical statistics where we hear 2.x% is the goal for the European Union. Are we actually capturing that, or is it totally part of a different universe?
If we are capturing R&D spending, so we're starting to do that. Yeah, so we are capturing it by R&D spending by corporates and by governments. But I would say we're in the first innings.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll release some data about it later this year, and it also fits with two other aspects, I think. So spin out data, so tracking startups that come out of universities. We're tracking that. And then also IP data and kind of patent data, we're also looking at it. And I know that Genome has done a huge amount of work on that already. And then, yeah, on the support side, just echoing what you just said, I think that all the first three things are being recognized by governments. So there's now kind of a competition also going on for talent and capital, and yeah, that's also an accelerant of entrepreneurship. And so our mission at Dealroom is really to empower economies to become more entrepreneurial through data transparency. So I mean, our role in it is purely on the data side, but our vision really is to provide kind of a central intelligence layer for entrepreneurial ecosystems worldwide. Just talking about like what we mean by an intelligence layer, how do we picture that? It's about having like one source of record that connects all the key players. So for governments, we are already, for the European Union, I think one way to communicate with the ecosystem, but we're also a way to measure economic activity, and not just startup activity, but it will, you know, as startups become a major part of the economy, it's about economic activity. For VCs, private equity banks, we want to be a way to track trends and do deal sourcing that can have a major impact. For startups, we want to be there to help them fundraising, at least on the data side, and it is mostly about data. And for corporates, I think it's more and more important that they are able to track innovation, that they see the bigger picture. And for example, in Europe, I think corporates are not innovative enough. So they need to be more aware of what's actually going on. So we want to help them with that.
Again, make the right connections based on identifying these trends. Absolutely can see that. Yeah.
My turn now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the size of the ecosystem. We have heard it is growing where you are.
So when we all started working with startups, first it was kind of strategic, then it became mandatory for cities and regions to keep pace in innovation. So we could keep competing with other cities, and cities compete with cities, as Yoram was saying. Ecosystems compete with ecosystems, even though we can cooperate. So startups and entrepreneurship became mandatory. And for a long time now, we have been preaching this and we have been supporting these strategies. And I had this meeting, I think it was 5 years ago, with an international investor, and I was just pitching Porto, how important and how good for this investor would be to come here, to meet our startups, to invest in our startups. And at some point, she said, okay, you speak a lot about ecosystem, but what's the size of the ecosystem? What's the size of the opportunity for me? And I was like, I know that's something for you, but I cannot quantify it. I cannot tell how big the opportunity is for you. So Stephan, if you don't mind to move to the next slide.
There you go.
And this is not the only question we have. We have so many questions to be answered. Who's involved? Who's contributing the most? Where are startups and spin-offs coming from? Are new companies being created? Are they growing or not? Are they finding the conditions to grow or not? Who are the stakeholders involved? Is it worth the investment, the public money that we are putting in this? Is it worth it? How can we justify the continuity of these strategies? So this is really, we have to create tools to answer these questions. And we also have to create tools to analyze the strategy and to make it accountable. So that's why, well, next slide, please. And these, when you're measuring the ecosystem and when you're measuring the impact and the connection between each one of these stakeholders, this is really hard to make, because this is, when you're identifying the stakeholders, there are so many, and with so many shapes and with so many different contributions. So you really have to identify them and to make sure that you involve all of them in this process of analysis and contribution in terms of data, and they are all under the same understanding of the need. So if you can move to the next slide. in the end of 2018, we started working with a Dealroom to launch the platform that we did in the beginning of 2019. But this was not the first data platform that we launched. In 2014, we had our first data platform, and it was really hard to keep the information gathered because it was crowdsourced. So information would get really out of date really fast. So, and it was really hard to maintain. So we really had to find a tool to keep track on the evolution of our ecosystem. And next slide, please. And this is not only a matter of collecting data and being able to analyze data. These tools for us are also important communication tools. So this is, for me, it happens quite often. Some investor comes to me and asks, do you have, what are the startups that are growing in this sector in Porto? Here we can find information. So this is an important communication tool for us. Then we also can, these stakeholders that I've just showed before, these stakeholders can use this as a communication tool as well, and as a tool for them to find the information, and it happens a lot. Also, for us, having such a tool is important to make our data available so we can be present in the international ranks. So it's not only for us to use, it's also to make the city and the ecosystem visible to to international stakeholders that are working with data as well. Then we have this need to measure the impact of our work and to also understand the evolution of the ecosystem. This is also a tool to the stakeholders, and this tool also must be as automatic and scalable as possible, even though we have some limitations that we can go in some more detail if you want to.
Daniela, thanks so much for the overview. And again, personal experience, I've seen many well-intended approaches to data collection, to ecosystem mapping. As you put it, crowdsourced, manually done by ecosystem leaders locally. And after half a year, 3 months, you name it, data start becoming stale, they start becoming outdated, and the ecosystem stakeholders lose interest, saying it's not accurate, it's not really depicting the reality. So love to see the evolution that you've taken here in order to get to this platform that so well depicts Porto. Yeah, I think this concludes a little bit our overview, the introduction. Let's right away dive into our Q&A, our discussion. And if I may open it a little bit, Daniela, I think you already alluded to, there was a decisive moment for you to consider, I need to do something different. I got 2016, I think you mentioned, you got a platform. Somebody, a VC, asked you a number of questions. Was there this decisive moment where you said, well, we need to change the game here, this is not good enough, we need to do something very different?
We always knew we needed data. At first, it was pretty much more about mapping the ecosystem, knowing who is involved. So we have to have these basics before we keep track, right? Before we can measure. So who's involved? And that was the first step that we took in 2014, mapping, understanding who's there. But then it's not only about the external pressure to provide numbers, it's also about the internal pressure and the internal need to understand the impact of what we are doing and the evolution of the ecosystem. Yeah. So besides understanding the impact that a strategy such as ScaleUp Porto could have, it's also understanding if we are evolving at the same pace as other ecosystems are evolving. If we are not, what's happening, what's going on? So why are we not evolving? So that's not a turning point. There's this need that we identified at first in the beginning of when we launched the strategy, but then every day we have this need, and these numbers are very much important, not only to measure what we do, but also to justify the work we do.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really understanding, obvious for us here at Genome, we do such a lot of peer comparison also understand where am I and am I doing well or not so well. As you can measure it longitudinal, but you also want to look at your peers and see what's the gap to best in class really, and what do I need to do in order to get there. So that's great to hear. Maybe move it over to you, Yoram, a little bit. Typical use cases for data platforms. What do you see in ecosystems? What are ecosystem leaders that approach Dealroom? What are they asking you?
Yeah, the most basic question that it starts with is, how many startups are there in my city? And it seems like such an obvious one, or maybe even a simple question. And the question is simple, but actually to give a good answer isn't that simple, because there are always a couple of startups that everybody knows. And then there are a couple of obvious startups that maybe are not so well known, but there's a lot of gray areas. So for example, maybe there is some kind of retail concept that got venture funding, that we count it or not. There is maybe a web agency, like a web development agency that you don't want to count, but they're also developing a product and they're selling it on a subscription basis. So does that count? So pretty soon, to answer the most basic question, you find out that you need to have quite a lot of information on each company. But that's where it all starts. And I would say the second, once you know kind of the baseline, okay, how big is the ecosystem? Like how many startups are we talking about? How much funding? And then the second thing is the trend. Like, is it growing? Or in which areas are growing? And then the third is, okay, I would like to compare this with other cities. How are we doing compared with other cities?
Yeah, makes complete sense. Daniela, from a data perspective, data points, you heard your number of startups, investment, development, growth. Anything we are missing? What's the most interesting KPI you really want to see?
So for us, the strategy is aimed at supporting companies scale up. So when you're considering scale ups, and if you go to OECD definitions, you consider the number of employees, the growth in terms of number of employees and revenue. So these are important numbers for us. Also, of course, investment. Are we attracting investment? So these are some of the important numbers, but there are some more interesting dynamics that we want to understand. So, like, what are the institutions in the ecosystem that are providing more spin-offs, so then we can analyze why. So these are all the kind of connections, and how are companies moving in between ecosystems? Are they shifting from Porto to other ecosystem? Are they moving their headquarters, for instance? Why? So these are some other informations that are important for us. These dynamics, how ecosystems move.
So you're trying to track data that tell us how is the ecosystem. If I look at the funnel, what's coming into the funnel? Is it university spin-offs? Is it startups coming from community? Is it spin-offs from larger traditional corporations? And then the second question, if I got that right, you're trying to answer is, how is my funnel actually shaped? Do I scale, or are the companies that are scaling going to larger ecosystems, which we've seen obviously in many places?
And how big is the funnel? Is it increasing or decreasing?
Have you both, Daniela and Yoram, have you seen kind of ecosystem policy action evolving after doing such analysis? Do you have a number of examples that you would like to share?
Now, yeah, one example I can share that I know from Amsterdam and also the Netherlands is that after we were able to prove very clearly that startups had a massive impact on employment, and we did this a couple of years ago, and it wasn't clear. People, I think, still thought about kind of co-working spaces, bunch of students playing like foosball, and that was the perception. And it turned out that it was actually one of the biggest contributors to job growth in Amsterdam. And this was like 3 years ago, and it was not really well known back then. And following that, the city like devoted a much bigger budget to its efforts, and like it became like a whole different on a whole different level that they started to look at the ecosystem, and that happened also on the Dutch scale.
From our side, maybe I'm spoiling the some content that we have prepared for later, but anyway, we using these data that we had at Dealroom, we started a study to understand the perception of the stakeholders, considering the several areas that support entrepreneurship in the city. So we did a study for characterization of the ecosystem, and we could understand our flaws and some points that we must improve and we must work on. Something that we also have done, and also to understand if there is any impact on this collective strategy for growth, was to understand if we have more scale-ups, and when do they become scale-ups? And we have some conclusions. So this is something that using this data, we were able to understand a few flaws, understand a few good things that we have been doing, and we are now able to reshape the strategy and to make it stronger in some points, so or to invest more in some areas of work, because we have these data.
And you actually, Daniela, thank you. And you're already showing us where we're heading with the discussion. Yoram will show us a number of additional slides around our second question: what's the impact of data measurement, in a minute. Before we do that, I picked up on this notion of, I think you both mentioned it, what is really a startup? And from where I'm coming from, what I'm seeing, I think, in this, apologies to our government national statistic offices, but I think they are normally not very good at defining what really is a startup. So we see these definitions based on some revenue terms, on some length of incorporation. How old is a company? In terms of number of employees, the most common one, and Daniela, you quoted the OECD definition for scale-ups here. We are always struggling that we are under the impression that national statistical offices typically amalgamate, have very broad definitions, and what you end up with is a mix of traditional SMEs. Yoram, you made a point about some, I don't know, a food franchise as an example. Are these really the startups we want to talk about? And if these definitions are not clear enough, are we really using data then? And do we really come to the right conclusions? I have my really big question marks here, because in the end, people like us, we look at an ecosystem, we use data to say, there are some gaps, there are some success factor gaps. We want to devise a strategy, and if the strategy is ill-informed, we will in the end get to the wrong conclusions, or we have to do it all again in order to have clean data and really base analysis properly on. So I wonder, do you have any particular definitions? I can take it away a little bit. We got a very formal one, Startup Genome, obviously very scientific and mathematical. But for me, the most simple one is actually, am I looking at a fast growth company that's equity investable? Would it be interesting to an angel? Would it be interesting to a VC? Sometimes I use this simple test to say, are we really talking about the same thing? And if then somebody comes back to me and says, well, there's a whole collection of startups, in brackets, they are all looking for bank loans in order to finance their growth of 5% a year, and they've been around for 10 years, that's probably more a traditional SME segment. Very well for economic development, but not really what we are talking about. So definitions of startups to get the foundations right. Does that resonate with you? Do you do anything special?
Yeah, with me, it resonates a lot what you said, and I agree with your definition actually. So we also look at it that way. Like we say, it's a company designed to grow fast, which we took from Paul Graham actually from Y Combinator. Yeah, we recently published an article about it ourselves. But yeah, it's misunderstood very often, and people want to look at like number of employees, age, growth, like 20% revenue growth or something like that, to be, and that's just completely missing the point. And then like there are lots of companies for which you don't have revenue data yet that are definitely a startup. But if you limit the length of a company's life to 5 years or 10 years, that means that you are not thinking about it correctly, I think. So the whole point of a startup is that it can become huge, and very few do, but roughly 1% of companies that get a seed funding become a unicorn. And it's all about, that's why you do it. So it's just like in scientific experiments, every now and then you have a breakthrough, and if you do it all for those breakthroughs, and so if you exclude those from your data set, we get that a lot. Like we have in Amsterdam Booking.com, which is a very old company actually already. But for us, it's the definition of a once startup. So yeah, okay, they're not a startup anymore, but they are a perfect example of what you're hoping to achieve. And so you want that as kind of part of your data set, because that's why you're doing this whole thing to begin with.
Yeah, that is a great understanding. Daniela, in Porto, do you use any strict definitions, or do you see this conundrum of SME segment on the one hand side and ecosystem on the other?
We could spend all day long here discussing this definition, and this is something that we have discussed not only in Porto but together with other cities that we work a lot with, namely in Scale Cities Network, which is a network of ecosystems that we are part of. We consider a startup a tech-based company that is highly scalable and investable. So this is our definition. But then, well, if we would consider age, for instance, it's not fair for biotech companies, because, or if we consider revenue, or many deep tech companies will not have revenue until they are, I don't know, 5 years old or something. So this is really difficult to establish. And then we know that some ecosystems consider tech service providers as startups. We don't. We consider them tech service providers, and that's why we separate them specifically in this mapping, in this platform. But it raises the question to me is how comparable are ecosystems in this kind of platforms when you don't have, when these definitions are so different from ecosystem to ecosystem, is how much can we compare ourselves and our growth to other ecosystems if we don't have these concepts as the same to begin with.
Yeah, so understood. Let's find a clear definition. Let's not go too far into detail today, but let's find a definition that really speaks for our cause and the policies we want to devise. And we all know it's a little bit ambiguous, but it certainly deserves, when you start as users of data in your ecosystem, really make sure you define the segment in a way, and you're tracking in a way that helps you understand what's happening. So our perspective, it really helps you devise the right strategies, understand where your success factor gaps. Do you need to put in place another workspace, another accelerator, a funding solution? What is it really? And really do that grounded on data that are pertinent to the discussion. I want to use this little opportunity here to take us a little bit towards impact. And Yoram, if I may ask you to show us a little bit more about what's the impact of a good data strategy for an ecosystem. I'll be pulling up the slides in a moment for all of us, so we get a real life example from your side. Give me 1 sec, please, to pull it up here. Here we are. It should get bigger in a moment. There we are. I hope you can see that now. So what's the impact of a data strategy for your ecosystem? And Yoram, you got a few pointers here for us to better understand what it is.
Yeah. I took here the example of La French Tech, but it could have taken Porto as well, or other places where we are. But the first impact is that we get a better coverage. So in France, we launched a data platform in August 2019. Actually the public launch was 1 year later in September 2019, and now we started at around 10,000 startups covered in France. Now we're at 25,000 100,000, including taking data from the trade register, a lot of user submitted data, and using AI. But really, our joint mission is to cover 100% of the ecosystem, and we're not even there yet. So that's one, better coverage. The second impact is that the amount of information per startup is growing significantly, and so we now have quite detailed taxonomy and tagging on individual companies, and then that also feeds into similar companies. So in this case, 3D Hubs is like a 3D printing marketplace, and you're able from this profile to kind of navigate their whole industry and their whole strategic landscape. So you also can understand the context of what this company does. In the top right, you see that we track the number of jobs that this company is hiring for, and also the number of employees. Tech stack data, which we get from a partner, predict leads. Founder score is something that's not on this page, but below. So we also kind of see what is the background of the team, how diverse is it, what's their university background, do they have founder experience, have they worked at other startups, these kind of things, to kind of get a sense, what the potential is of this company. So that's the second impact, is a lot more information per startup that you can do a lot of things with.
That's obviously advertising the startup to an outside investor, to somebody who is contemplating the next career step.
Yes, exactly.
So puts you on the map. That's what I think that's the simplification of what I meant with replacing marketing collateral for an ecosystem with hard factual data. I think that's what we see on the screen right now.
Yeah.
And let me move you over a little bit. I think now we are seeing the aggregate. Yeah,
exactly. So we've started to invest a lot of in jobs data, because we noticed that there is a lot of demand for that, which makes sense. And I think it's amazing that our platform can be used for that. So we're aggregating data. In France, we partnered with a company called Welcome to the Jungle. And that's a local job board, but we also take data from Indeed and also scrape it directly from the startup's website. So we do this also in Porto. And so the cool thing is that if you're a job seeker, you can do a really detailed search. For instance, the one I like is I'm looking for a job at a social impact startup at the Series A stage. But it can also be, let's say you are a fintech specialist, fintech engineer. You can search also for fintech, or go into payment. You can do all types of searches that you simply cannot do on a traditional job board. So I think that really facilitates the ecosystem.
Daniela, maybe as a proof is in the pudding, does it really work? Do you attract investment or a talent seeker from abroad to come and join your scale-ups in Porto?
Well, there's a broader strategy from the city to work on the talent attraction and the positioning of the ecosystem. And for sure, if we are not there and if we are not communicating the ecosystem, well, we are not an option. And nowadays that people look for jobs, even if they don't move to places, right? If people work remotely, we have to be there for sure. So, yeah, we have to be there.
That's great to hear. We see the answer right on the screen. Yoram, I'll move you on a little bit.
Yeah, another cool thing that's the impact of building a local ecosystem is that you can start to see curated content being created, and we do that ourselves. Our research team puts time on it, but we share a lot of data on social media, and that attracts people from the ecosystem who then volunteer to create this kind of content. to do like a landscape, for example, within sustainability here on water conservation and management, on female-founded startups. Turns out that there are loads of people in every ecosystem who deeply care about it being promoted in the right way, and so they help in building this. So this is like a continuously growing library of curated content. So it's not just raw data, but also something that's like inspiring to read.
Yeah, and data really becomes curated information. But here we got a question from our audience here, maybe to both of you. How difficult is that actually to achieve, to put data together in a way? I mean, we all know, we pick a startup, we look at it, we think, well, this might have something to do with a sustainable solution or a climate change solution. Maybe not. You have to look it up properly. You have to understand it, maybe call the founder, which is a highly laborious process. So are there any limitations? Do you see limitations in these data? How well does it work for both of you?
Now, I saw also that the question, like, how do you get startups to contribute? And actually, this is a really good way to do that. So once you go out and say, this is the water conservation and management landscape in France, then if you're a startup that does that, you really want to be on there. So we found out that that's a really good way to attract startups and to get them to help. It is difficult, and one way that we make it a bit less difficult is to be really approachable. So whether it's on social media or on our chat, we try to respond instantly. And make it easy for people to comment and to contribute and to make it better.
Daniela, do you feel you are represented properly? Does it work for you, or do you have to invest a lot of time in order to say, well, it's a startup first of all, secondly, it's doing something for climate change or for sustainability, or it's very diverse in its makeup?
Actually, with the platform helps us a lot with taxonomy. It's really hard to place startups in their places because they can be so many things, right? So it helps a lot in the organization of information. And about these gathering of information, these landscapes, this is something that we have been investing. We have been investing more and more, and we have been involving the communities to help us do that. So we recently prepared a landscape on health tech in the city, not only of startups, but also on the major corporates and the pharma in the region, and also the R&D organizations that contribute to the ecosystem of health tech. And then we had the curation of incubators and all the communities that are actively involved in the health tech sector here in the region. And this is a way for us also to improve the quality of the information and and how much current it is. So this is something that we have been using to engage with the stakeholders.
What I'm hearing is we are using a standardized platform, a standardized taxonomy. Dealroom is already providing a whole host of data, but you're also using something that I would call more crowdsourced information in order to input into the system. Is that a fair description of how it works?
Yes, and it's not only to improve the system, but also to engage the players and to make them use the platform as well and understand the value of it, the value of having cured the information.
Thank you for that. Yeah, maybe a brief perspective on VC data. Yoram, you have a few pointers here for us.
Yeah, I have a couple of slides, and we can go very quick because I don't want to overwhelm. But in terms of impact, I just wanted to give a flavor of what you can do when you have good data. So here we're looking at the impact of on employment per startup after how many years. And actually, we were talking about how old can a startup be. It turns out that only after year 10 does the startup really start to have a big impact on its ecosystem in terms of contributing into employment. So I think that's interesting. But yeah, this is just an example of what you can do when you have good data.
And love the numbers. Where I'm sitting, we believe, and we don't have the exact right data, that it's possibly 9 to 10% of national employment is already dependent on the tech startup sector in some shape or form, direct employment and indirect employment. So that's interesting to see, but I also love to hear these insights, debunking a little bit the myth that it is only 2 or 3 companies that grow within 2 years and create all these jobs. Which certainly is not true, certainly not true in deep tech. If we move you a little bit further, funding, different series here that you can show. I think that's also interesting to better understand the funnel and the funding in regards to funnel stages.
Exactly. Yeah, this is something that got shared a lot, and we show this on different levels, but yeah, you can see here the red basically is showing domestic funding, and this is London, I think. Yeah, London. Then the pink is showing cross-border funding from Europe. So, for example, from France to London, and the red is anywhere in the UK within investing in London, but it's mostly coming from London itself. And then the gray part shows funding coming from the rest of the world, including Asia and the US. So at the seed stage, it's mostly local. Series A also still mostly local, but with a significant chunk also coming from abroad. But then from Series C and mega rounds plus onwards, it's almost entirely financed out of Asia and the US. Yeah. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's good to know at least, and see if you're happy with that as an ecosystem. And I think what most people are saying is it's good to have that mix, but it needs to be by choice, and there appears to be not enough late stage capital in Europe at the moment.
And again, I really like the insight, because data is one thing, but taking that into action. So when I look at this ecosystem where I'm sitting, there's probably an implication of where do we need to attract late stage finance from? Where do we need to present our scale-ups to? So directly, it's not only a depiction of the reality today, but it informs the strategy for the next few years. If I look at these slides, I probably would have a number of ideas as an ecosystem leader in order to act upon. We are running a little bit out of time here. Got a number of more questions for the audience. We will come back to a number of the questions you've posted with us today in writing, give you a few more comments. Maybe as a closing statement, data-driven strategy for your ecosystem. Daniela, maybe the 2-3 takeaways you would like to share with everybody, and Yoram, you as well, if I may ask you.
So, data is now important, fundamental for every business. So it's no different for ecosystems, and we can only improve what we know. So that's like mandatory nowadays. So for us, it's not only a matter of communication, it's a matter of providing tools, of analyzing the work we do and the evolution of the ecosystem, but also connect with other ecosystems and make our and improve these connections to other ecosystems and to other opportunities. So this is not only about knowing ourselves, but to pushing the ecosystem and make it more international and more available to international stakeholders.
Yoram, maybe the 2-3 takeaways. And I'm looking at audience questions. Maybe give us your two key takeaways, but also let us know where you're actually available. So we got questions of, are you available in Australia? Are you available in the Southeast Asian region?
Yeah, exactly. I was typing the answers. So, I mean, we are already live in Melbourne and Victoria, the Victoria region, and working on other parts of Australia. And we're also talking with some cities in the US to hopefully go live there soon as well. So we can basically launch anywhere in the world within say 2-3 months. The couple of the couple of takeaways is, I think, is the number one is to start early and to plan for the long term. Like our longest customers have been Amsterdam, Netherlands. Now we're in over 36 cities, but in Amsterdam, you see the database is integrated with the trade register. We have a huge amount of detail, and the data is being used at lots of different levels now within the city government. So if you really start early, then in 2-3 years, you have something really valuable.
Again, Daniela, Yoram, thanks so much for the insights. I really love the discussion. From our perspective, I can only emphasize what both of you said from a Genome perspective. Please consider a data strategy very early on in ecosystem development. It's going to inform the way you as ecosystem leaders, agencies working on behalf of your startups, are going to analyze, to draw conclusions, and even go into strategy discussions about government budgets, funding solutions, etc., on a very well-informed basis. And I think this makes a whole lot of a difference to what we saw in the past. The people come into these discussions based on gut feeling, on examples they've seen elsewhere, traveled to Silicon Valley, came back with 5 ideas that are possibly not pertinent to a Porto or to a London or to a Belgrade or whatever it is, but rather to have the availability of informed analysis that really helps us devise good strategies and then see how are we doing as we track against them. So Daniela, you're building increasingly a scaling segment. Is it really working? And where are still the gaps remaining? Do you need more talent? Do you need more late stage investment? I think that's what we all can see. To have a system that codifies and standardizes a little bit in terms of the software, in terms of the way we classify information, to have a standard, not everybody to make it up themselves, but using something that's established and really gives us a standard to compare and to peer compare. I think that's also very important as a key takeaway. And then again, to have a system that's not dependent entirely on manual input, but something that's designed to be updated automatically and feeds on so many data sources, I think is absolutely the way forward from our perspective. We have to unfortunately leave it here, as we are already a few minutes over the hour as promised. If you have more questions in regards to the topic, please come back to either us here at Startup Genome, but more importantly to our guests today. And let me just briefly show the contact data again for all of you. I hope you can see it right now. So Yoram at Dealroom.co, and Daniela in Porto with Porto Digital and ScaleUp Porto at Daniela.Monteiro at portodigital.pt. We'll be sharing the information via email after the session today. Please don't hesitate to get in contact, and let's get a discussion going around this super important topic. Again, big thank you, Daniela, for joining us, Yoram for joining us from Amsterdam this morning. And for all of you for making it to the webinar. Our next webinar in May, we'll be advertising it very soon, and you get the respective calendar invites. So thanks very much for spending time with us. I hope it was insightful, and hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Stay safe.